Peace be with us all. It's my pleasure to welcome us to an amazing evening. Just look around you. I'm sure you've already been doing this, but take another look at all the wonderful people that have graced this hall. Trust you're enjoying some of the delicious food and are prepared to move off the sidelines into countering the epidemic of dangerous speech. We've been addressing this subject now for several years, but never as directly or substantively as we are tonight. That's thanks to the Reverend Terry Murphy, who is one of the founders of the Faith Community Response Team and a deacon at the Episcopal Church of the Ascension in Silver Spring. She became sufficiently upset with the needless, tragic violence that she decided to learn more and went online to figure out what was behind the growth of hate groups in our country and terrorist groups abroad. And she was sufficiently alarmed that she brought that to the co-chairs of our Faith Community Working Group. And I would like her now to stand together with all of her friends from the Church of the Ascension, some who are helping now serve the meals, and I'm sure in other places here, and be acknowledged for what you have done. You're a model for us. I was just asked by one of the reporters about what we could expect coming out of this, and I was suggesting is following this example of being at home just on your own computer and realizing something more should be done and keep pushing enough buttons, and this is the result of it, all right? Okay, now I'm going to introduce the co-chairs then, that in turn have moved on to make this possible. I'm asking you to hold your applause until I have introduced them. The Reverend Dr. Carol Flitt is also the ecumenical and interreligious officer for the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. This is Carol. Rabbi Batya Steiner is also the Director of Social Justice and Interfaith Initiatives for the Jewish Community Relations Council, and she was especially helpful in identifying several of the speakers for tonight and in helping with the food. Dr. Hedia Meramati is the founder of WORD and the president of the International Cultural Center. She has an international reputation for countering extreme violence, and in Montgomery County is known as a leader in creating social cohesion and creating events like we have tonight. Let us give them a deserved well-rounded. So I met with Hedia's team yesterday to talk about this, and they reminded me that between myself and my friend Jim Stowe, that I'll be introducing momentarily, that we had just like 10 minutes, and so I should only acknowledge Hedia, but I can't do that. I'm going to break their devoted rule and call them up. Come on, one of them's about ready to go out of the door here, you see. Sign me a hug right there. Come on, raise your hand. She's already on her feet. Maureen, where are you? Okay, Maureen Perron, she was just here helping getting the sound system back working again. Oh, good, right there. And Lauren Haggett. Okay, right next to her. Come on, let's pay the registration. We were here, over an hour ago, setting all of this up. And they do it again and again and again with a smile. We can't thank you enough. And so we would not be here, of course, without our co-sponsors. So I'm just going to quickly read through those names and ask you to stand wherever you are. This, again, is what makes this possible. It's all a matter of collaboration. The Anti-Defamation League, Countering Extremism Project, the Jewish Community Relations Council. We've acknowledged the Episcopal Church of the Ascension, the Black Ministers Conference President, Reverend Gray, the Montgomery County's Office of Human Rights, Safe Silver Spring, Tony, the Islamic Society of Germantown, Rockville United Church. We thank you all. introducing a very good friend and colleague whose name is synonymous with breaking all the barriers that might otherwise separate us from our human family. Jim Stowe is the director of the Office of Human Rights and a partner in all that we do, from responding to acts of hate and violence to celebrating our essential unity in the midst of diversity. You might note, Jim, I'm getting a plug in here for our friendship picnic the first Sunday in September. So, brother, come forward. Jim, it's wonderful to have you here offering opening remarks.
People hate each other because people fear each other. People fear each other because people don't know each other. And people don't know each other because they are often separated from each other. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I suspect that when the framers talked about this grand experiment called democracy, these 13 independent organizations, these colonies, these folks who had worked so very hard to become who they were, trying to come together and begin to share and experience in ways that were so very, very different and uncommon to many of them. But feeling it worthwhile enough to give it a try. And I suspect these very strong personalities crafted out this document called the Constitution of the United States of America, and when they did so, one of the things that had me to really sort of understand more and more about what was going on was that they had to come to terms about what was acceptable, even within the confines of being independent, trying to remain who they were, for all they had fought, bled, and died for to become who they in fact were. But there was acceptable reasons when it came time for freedom of speech. The idea, I believe, may have been, not a historian, don't claim to be one, but I rather suspect that. The idea was that I still can express myself in all the kinds of ways that I need to ensure that my voice is in the room. But even then, I suspect there was a level of acceptance about what that might be and how that might be expressed, and what terms one might receive what might be said. So then the shower fire in the movie theater creates a certain kind of dynamic that people have generally accepted. That's probably not a good idea. But can I say how I really feel about you if we are different, if we believe differently, if we think differently, if we come from different parts of the world, if we are after the same bit of resources and competition for that same very meager resources maybe? Does all that change? Does now my voice in the room become more important than your voice in the room? And now can my statements of what I believe be inflammatory? Can it be harmful? Can it be threatening? I was suspecting this experiment called America. The heavy lifting in being free means freedom of thought, right? It means freedom of expression, right? But where is that balance? Where is that place we begin to separate that freedom we call freedom of speech and now are defined today what is referred to as hate speech? What's the balance in Montgomery County? Let's really break it down to where we are and where we live in every community throughout this county. What does it mean for us? What is acceptable in Montgomery County? Let me share with you very quickly that unfortunately in our schools, because those reports come to me, we're starting to hear words that I thought were gone years ago. I didn't think in 2016 I would hear the N-word being uttered about in the hallways of our schools. Are you kidding me? In 2016? Goodness gracious, I really was so upset and surprised that we had young Muslim girls who were afraid to wear their headdress because somebody would snatch it from them in 2016. Because you see, in Montgomery County, we're among some of the most educated persons in the state of Maryland. So we know about it. We're not coming from a point of ignorance. We have over 164 different nationalities who live in Montgomery County. We've been around people from all around the world. We should know better. Where's the balance? Where's the point of demarcation? And so tonight we come to hear from some folks who can share with us some ideas about how we in Montgomery County establish where our balance is. That freedom to say what I believe and to be who I am and to stand up for what that might be. At the same time, then trying to give them room and space enough so that I can be who I want to be. I can say what I want to say. I can believe as I want to believe. Where's the balance? And so tonight we come then to share from perspectives of these great, great persons of thought and wisdom and study on this very important issue. And so I hope you've come tonight prepared not only to hear, to receive, and to learn, but also help us figure that out. Because I would love to have us one day be able to make a statement. Matter of fact, the Office of Human Rights and the Human Rights Commission and the Committee on Hate Violence are working on this very idea. Might there be something that kind of binds us together that regardless of what happens, we here in Montgomery County remain who we are. Strong, upright, great diversity, but great character as well. And so, my friends, I'm very excited about being a part of this discussion tonight because you see, you and I, we all meet as strangers, each carrying a mystery within us. I cannot say who you are. I may never know you completely, but I trust you are a person in your own right, possessed with a value and a beauty that are the earth's richest treasures. So I make this promise to you. I will impose no identity upon you, but will allow you to be who you are without shame or fear. I will open up a place for you in the Word and allow your right to fill it with an authentic purpose and vocation. And for long as it takes to become who you are, you should always have my loyalty. We thank you. Have a good evening, and let's learn the balance. Thank you very much.
Jim, you've already made it worthwhile being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, get to introduce the moderator for this evening. We'll be introducing our featured speakers and leading us in our Q&A. She has credentials well beyond the rest of us this evening for this particular job. Look at her biographical sketch, and you can't, at least if you're all like me, help but to be downright envious of the breadth and depth of her life experience. Yasmin Nasri, you are a source of insight, promise, and hope even before you stand up, and we're glad you're here and look forward to your leading us on through the rest of the evening. Come forward. We welcome you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Reverend Casey. Thank you so much to all the co-sponsors and to Word for putting on this extremely important and timely event on how to stop dangerous speech. I am a civil rights attorney with a background in immigration and working within the federal government sphere. I'm also a public policy specialist who recently graduated, as you can tell from my biographical information. It's such an honor to be here, to be speaking amongst you, and we're hoping that this will be a discussion. We will have our three speakers speak, and each of them will have a 40-minute allotted time with 20 minutes, around 20-minute presentation and then 20 minutes for questions. I want to remind everybody that we are tweeting from this event because that is the new era that we live in, both good things about it and bad things about it. It's bad when it's used for hate speech, but it's great when we're tweeting gems from this particular program that is trying to change the rhetoric and change the direction of what we see, unfortunately, permeating in our media, the wrong direction that the country is going, sometimes, and allowing for racist talk and dangerous speech to take front and center. So I want to encourage you to post using the hashtags #TakeItDown and the other hashtag digital disruption. So that's hashtag #TakeItDown and hashtag digital disruption. I also want to remind you to please fill out the brief survey that is on your tables before you leave, so that we may provide even better programming in the future. I am so delighted to be introducing our first speaker, who is a legal scholar and educator, someone who I admire very much just by reading her bio. And by meeting her, you get a sense that she is even greater than what you read about her here. She's the faculty associate at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. She's had a long history teaching refugee law and human rights at AU, at Georgetown, and Princeton, among many other universities. In 2012 to 2013, she was the Edith Everett Genocide Prevention Fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Please welcome Ms. Susan Benish to the floor.
I want to tell you what a great honor and a privilege it is for me to speak to you. How intimidated I am, in the best sense, by this extraordinary group of people. I must say, when I first heard about you, I was inspired and even cheered up, which is something that does happen to be a lot in my life in general, but studying dangerous and hateful speech is not always so much fun. So I just want to first express my admiration to you, and frankly, listening to the Reverend Stowe has already been an honor and a privilege and an inspiration. And I'd like to invite you into a conversation, beginning with a couple of odd ideas that I'll float to you about how to find that balance. And then secondly, I'd like to make some suggestions that I hope will cheer you up also. I do research on how exactly one can diminish either what I call dangerous speech or hateful speech, or diminish its impact. That is to say, the harm that it does in the world, and I'll show you a few examples of that. And then I will stop talking as soon as I can to invite your difficult questions. So first of all, this term dangerous speech that appeared in those great big, huge letters on the screen. What is dangerous speech? Why dangerous speech? Why didn't the poster say hate speech? I have kind of coined this term dangerous speech for a couple of reasons. One is that hate speech, although that is a very well-known, commonly used term, is not very well defined. There is no consensus. I'm just setting myself a timer so I shut up quickly enough. Okay. Hate speech is variously defined both in law and in common parlance. There is a wide variety of definitions in various different bodies of law. And if you ask people to give you an example of hate speech, almost every 2 examples will represent different understandings of that term. That worries me as a lover of freedom of expression, and simply as a a practitioner who would like to figure out how to overcome a problem, you need to be able to define the problem clearly first, I think. So if you try to restrict hate speech, you ought to know first what it is. Secondly, hate speech refers to hatred. And this may strike you as odd, but it's not very clear even what hatred is. It's an emotion, it's strong, but that's another difficult line to draw I'd like to suggest to you. And when you say hate speech, I want to ask you, whose hate are you talking about? That's also never very clear. Is it the hate in the mind of the person speaking? If so, that's very difficult to measure, and maybe not very interesting, actually. Is it hate that that person would like to create or amplify in the minds of the people listening? That would be a very different possibility, and it's also tough to measure. Or are we referring to hate, to the feeling of being hated that that sort of speech might create? And then I can't entirely leave this topic without mentioning that the great legal scholar, a true great legal scholar, Robert Post, points out that even hatred is not always bad. For example, the poet Walt Whitman reminds us to hate, for example, tyranny. And then, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King, as the Reverend Stowe has reminded us, pointed out that people hate when they fear. So in fact, I think that the speech we're really worried about may have, in the end, more to do with fear and other emotions than, in fact, with hatred. So now that gets us to dangerous speech. I'd like to suggest this category, dangerous speech, as speech that inspires or increases the risk of violence between groups. Why do I say that? First of all, because I think it's more useful to focus on what such speech can do, what this bad speech, as one of my colleagues insists on calling it. He's a data scientist and he gets frustrated with all this definitional stuff. It's a bad speech. Well, if we're worried about bad speech, we ought to know why, and I would like to persuade you that the reason why is what it can do in the world. And one of the consequences that we could most easily agree on is that we don't want people to attack one another. So we could say dangerous speech is speech that increases the risk that people will, in fact, attack one another, which they do very often precisely because they fear one another. So therefore, if you look at that slide, maybe you'll agree with me that not all hate speech is dangerous. Sometimes one can say something terribly hateful, but it doesn't increase the risk of violence between groups. And then on the other hand, there's speech that is not hateful, but that is dangerous. So that's this little category of dangerous speech. Now I'm going to show you a little bit about how one might identify it in practice, how one might draw the line between what is dangerous and what isn't. I do want to assure you that it isn't that I don't care about hate speech, or that I don't think that we ought to try to proceed against also speech that is hateful but not dangerous, just that it may also be useful to think about this other category. So how can you identify speech that is dangerous? I think that there are these five factors, contextual factors, and based on that I've proposed, when I'm trying to sound impressive and academic, I would call an analytical framework. But in any case, it's just these five factors. They need not be relevant in a given case for the speech to be dangerous. However, you need at least two of them. And Aristotle identified the first three, so I'm just plagiarizing from him and adding two more. First of all, as you know, some speakers are much more able to influence people. I like to tell my students, for example, that I couldn't be a successful dangerous speaker even if I wished to, because there's no audience that cares sufficiently what I think, including them. And they're forced to listen to me, and you guys, kindly enough, seem, at least so far, to be sticking it out voluntarily. Nonetheless, I'm not an influential enough speaker to be dangerous. I'm also happy to say that I'm sure that you all are not a sufficiently susceptible audience to respond to dangerous speech. I could tell you, or even a more influential speaker could tell you any number of horrible things and try to incite you to violence, and you all are, I feel confident in saying, if nothing else based on your presence here, you all are not a susceptible audience, so the chances that you'll respond with violence are virtually nil. That leads us to the third factor, which is the content. There are uncanny, striking, almost weird patterns that emerge if you study speech that precedes episodes of intergroup violence. You all know the first pattern that I usually identify. That is to say, a rhetorical device that is very often used in speech by unscrupulous, rotten leaders trying to activate one group of people against another one violently. Can anybody guess what one of those patterns is? It's a way of describing one group of people to another. Sorry? Scapegoating, more specifically, people are often compared to exactly us and them, and even more specifically, if I'm a dangerous speaker, I would compare the other, the them, to animals, disfavored animals, to insects, to vermin, to cancer, to bacteria. I describe human beings as something bad, something frightening, and especially something that it is perfectly okay to harm. I'm sorry to say that I know the words for rat and cockroach in a dizzying variety of languages, because those seem to be the two creatures to which human beings are most often compared in this kind of speech. Maybe because those are two sorts of creatures that are most universally despised and seen as dispensable. So I think that that dehumanization does something to one group of people in their view of another group of people. It makes them regard violence as what? Acceptable, exactly, acceptable. I'll just mention another couple of patterns quickly to you. The second one has a horribly apt nickname, which is accusation in a mirror. And that is when a dangerous speaker says to the in-group, watch out for, fill in the blank, them. You've got to protect yourselves against them. They're coming, swarming, in large numbers, maybe crossing a border. They are gathering weapons. They are planning. They are planning to attack you. They present an existential threat to you. That is called accusation in the mirror. Why? Because I'm telling you to fear exactly what I'm hoping to get you to condone doing to them. Do you see that? That's the mirror aspect. And I think, this is of course all supposition, but I think this is important. Why? Because accusation in a mirror is the collective analog of the one ironclad defense to murder in every legal system I know. What is that? Self-defense, exactly. So if you can persuade a group of people that they are facing an existential, a mortal threat at the hands of another group of people, then they feel they have the collective analog of self-defense. At this point, terrible treatment is not only acceptable, it's what? Necessary, exactly. So if you're really good, dangerous speaker, acceptable is just you know, child's play, that's nothing. You want necessary, because of course if you have achieved necessary, that's very effective, sad to say. And one last pattern that I'll mention is to say that a member or members of the other group are besmirching or polluting or in some way damaging the integrity or the purity of the in-group. That is another striking pattern. I could rattle off any number of examples of this to you, and I won't because to save time, but I'm happy to do so in response to your questions if you wish. I just want to take the opportunity to point out that unfortunately this kind of language is prevalent in a tremendous variety of cultures, of countries, of religions, of political groups, of ethnic groups, even of historical periods. In other words, I'm sorry to say there is no human group that specializes in this. If so, it would be great. We could say, oh, the them. There's something wrong with them. There's something particular about them. You know, the Germans, the Serbs, the somebodies. It's them. I'm afraid it's not them. It's all of us. There are these funny patterns. And so let me barrel on and say that the last two contextual factors are the social and historical context. There are many specific features of social and historical context that can make speech more powerful, more dangerous, more effective in the context in which it is made or disseminated. And finally, the means of dissemination can itself confer what the philosophers of language call force or power on language. For example, if all of us are depending on a particular radio station for our news, or even on a particular website, or we're used to listening to content in a certain language, which is our mother tongue, as they say in some countries, then the fact that a message is disseminated by that means can make it more powerful. I'm going to go now very quickly through some slides that explain dangerous speech, and then I'd like to finish by showing you some examples of what we are sometimes now calling counter speech. That is to say, ways in which people push back on hateful speech and dangerous speech. It's not a panacea, but it can sometimes help to establish what the Reverend Stowe called the level of acceptance of certain kinds of speech within a particular society. And also this counter speech, believe it or not, I'm going to demonstrate it with examples, in some cases can bring people around. It can change minds much more than you might suspect. So just a few questions to explain these 5 factors regarding social and historical context. If you were wanting to make an educated guess about the dangerousness of speech in context, you might ask, for example, are there underlying grievances between groups? Have there been episodes of violence following dangerous speech between the relevant groups and so on? Hallmarks are these patterns that I mentioned. There are certain specific forms of susceptibility in audiences. A speaker may be particularly influential for a number of different reasons, including personal charisma and, for example, the capacity to exert authority or force. And then the means of dissemination. I already mentioned that this may refer to a medium of dissemination or even to a language. Now, to undermine dangerous speech, of course, there are the 2 traditional methods that human authorities have always used against any kind of speech they didn't like. that is to say usually governments and sometimes clerical authorities, have had just really two tools in the toolbox. The first one is suppressing the speech, or censorship, and the second one is punishing the speaker, usually imprisonment or even death. Those are the only two tools, censorship and punishment. I don't think they've ever worked very well to actually suppress speech and its consequences. These days, with the prevalence of online means of dissemination, I think that censorship and punishment are even less effective than they've ever been. So what else have we got? Generally speaking, two other options. One is what we are sometimes calling inoculation, borrowing the term from public health. If you could make people less susceptible to dangerous speech or hateful speech in the same way that rather than trying to eradicate a bacterium entirely, you can greatly diminish illness by making people less susceptible to it with inoculation. So maybe with education, you could make people less susceptible to dangerous, harmful, or hateful forms of speech. I've had the great privilege of taking part in some efforts like that, and we'll be happy to discuss them again in response to questions. The second kind of response, as I said, is what people are calling counter-speech. I say individual and community, that is to say that one may counter-speak to one person, one-to-one, or one-to-many. Those are quite different, and they have rather different effects. Let me just show you a few examples of that. This is an appalling, and I must apologize. I am very sorry to show you some of this content. I thought hard about it and concluded that I couldn't really show you the example without showing you both sides. This is just over a year ago, Martin Luther King Day last year. A teenager tweeted, as you see there in that first tweet. A brilliant, thoughtful, kind, self-possessed writer responded with a series of citations from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There were something like 50 tweets in this exchange of tweets. I can't bring myself to call it a dialogue, and yet in some ways that is what it was. So from these few tweets that I've chosen, you can see that one person continues to express hatred, and the other one continues to respond with kind, compassionate language of her own as well as of Dr. King's. Here are some more of those tweets, and there is a shift where one says, "Does your mom know you spend your time on the internet trying to hurt people?" And this youth responds to that, "I doubt it. She's been dead for 1.5 years now, so." And then, again, I couldn't bring you 50 tweets, so I have, of course, deleted the vast majority. And that means you arrive rather abruptly at this very surprising response, "You are so nice and I'm so sorry." And from there really was a dialogue between these two people, which I commend to you. You can easily find it online. It was published in its entirety on the Daily Kos. And you might say to me, "Look, this is just one kid." And I'd say, yeah, that's true, but first of all, he's not the only one. And the dissemination of this kind of exchange between two people, I think, can be powerful, in part because it shows us that it is possible to bring around even someone who expresses himself with hatred and calling for violence. And also because this demonstrates to many others where that balance is, what sort of language is not acceptable to us in Montgomery County, to us on a website, to us in the United States, to us in the world. Here's another example from 2005. After Nina Davaluri, the child of immigrants from India, was chosen as Miss America, someone tweeted, by the way, another I'm afraid, a characteristic pattern of some dangerous speech is bad spelling and grammar. I am literally so mad right now, up arrow 1 Miss America. So this demonstrates not only bad grammar and spelling, but also another characteristic of dangerous speech often, which is ignorance. It's wrong, it's false, in addition to hateful. Many people pointed this out to the author of the original tweet. You can see, by the way, that there is, as there is also quite a lot of variation in hateful and dangerous speech, there is variation in counter speech. From one day, I hope you realize how shameful this tweet is, I hope you realize it tomorrow, to ignorant, illiterate, racist idiot. That's the less gentle form of counter speech, and I can assure you there's more that is even less gentle than that. This is what is striking. And it took a while, but it is fascinating to look at this Twitter account as this guy moves from his angry, defensive, nasty tone to his apology. You may have heard of a church very different from those represented here tonight. That is the Westboro Baptist Church. Fred Phelps was the minister of the Westboro Baptist Church, and he made that church famous for its picketing of, in particular, funerals of American servicemen and women who had been killed in combat. The church members would picket such funerals with appalling signs full of hatred, illustrating Fred Phelps' contention that that the people being buried at those funerals had died because God was punishing the United States for example, condoning homosexuality. Megan Phelps Roper is the granddaughter of Fred Phelps. She grew up in that church. She did a lot of that picketing and was fully and utterly in agreement with all of the tenets of the church. And she engaged in dialogue with some other people, including a rabbi, on Twitter, and now credits those conversations on Twitter with changing enormously her point of view. She left the church and she now thinks very differently. So this is another striking example of counter-speech. It's a very interesting article describing this process that was published in the New Yorker. And then I'm terribly sorry to end with this disgusting hashtag. However, I want to tell you that this hashtag has trended more than once on Twitter. It has, however, each time it has trended, it has been taken over by counter-speakers, like this one. So that it trended much more massively, thanks to people opposed to it, who expressed their opposition in a variety of ways, than thanks to people who tweeted in support of it. And this has been noticed to some extent. I would like to suggest to you that it should be noticed much more and publicized much more, because that in and of itself has some impact on who we are, what our identity is as individuals and as a society, how we perceive ourselves and each other, and also, quite importantly, on our collective perception of what it is acceptable to say and do. Because finally, this is the land of the First Amendment. The United States is extremist in the sense that our law is more protective of speech than any other, anywhere in the world. There is no country that protects its citizens' right to say appalling, hateful, even dangerous things to the extent that United States law does. However, we have got, believe it or not, very strong informal rules about what it is and is not acceptable to say. Those rules operate less effectively than they did in recent times, as the Reverend Stone has pointed out to us. However, they are still quite robust in many circumstances. They don't work as well online in many cases as they do offline, and that's something I'm trying to work on. In any case, thank you so much. I'm so much looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very kindly for the wealth of information. I just have two questions, very brief. One, and that is defining the difference between de jure and de facto when it comes down to dangerous speech. And then secondly, is there any research that has been done or is in the process of being done regarding self-hatred or self-dangerous speech? Is there any research that's being done?
Thank you. So regarding de jure and de facto, de jure in law, de facto in fact, dangerous speech is not a crime anywhere. It's just an idea that, at least as I've defined it, it's an idea that I've cooked up and have suggested as a tool for preventing various harms that I think speech can carry out. And although I confess I'm a lawyer, I am quite skeptical of the capacity of criminal law to diminish speech harms, in part because criminal prosecution is very slow and tends to publicize the person and the subject of the prosecution quite a lot. And so in some circumstances, I think prosecution can even do more harm than good. So dangerous speech is not a crime. However, since you asked, in the United States, it is a crime to speak to a group of people in such a way that there is a significant risk of what we call imminent lawless action. So, and then de facto, as I said, we have a lot of rules about what can and can't be said that are unspoken and uncodified. For example, although I'm sorry to say apparently the N-word is again being used in Montgomery County schools, I'm appalled to hear that. I do like to ask my students at AU how likely it is that an American political candidate will use that word knowing that the microphone is on in public. And they usually say the likelihood is 0 or close to 0. And then I ask them why, and they say because the candidate would immediately lose that election. So that is an example of de facto norm, a de facto norm against a particular kind of speech, and we do have many. So informal rules can in fact be quite powerful. And the second thing about de facto or informal rules is that they can change quickly in the wrong direction and also in the right direction. For example, personally, I'm very pleased that we now have a term in the United States that is marriage equality. And I'm also quite stunned by that, since if you'd asked me 20 years ago if we would have such a term, or you told me, let's say, 20 years ago that we would have a term like that, and prominent Republicans would say it was a conservative issue and things like that, I would have laughed at you. Is there anybody who was an adult 20 years ago in this room who would have predicted that? Or maybe you at least, yeah, I've seen people shaking their heads. That is an example of a very rapid change in speech norms in terms of human history. And regarding the second question about self-hatred, that can be a very complex question. If you're talking about self-harm, or language that seems to indicate someone's propensity to self-harm, there is quite a lot of good research on that that is being used to try to prevent serious self-harm, including suicide. I'm not sure that that's what you're asking though.
I think it's important, Professor, that you understand me and those persons who are present here, that you understand my question. What I was alluding to is that a person of his own race, of his own culture, being the chief culprit in bringing forth self-hatred. That does exist, and my question was, is there any research being done in it, that you know of regarding that?
Yeah, first I'm so sorry I misunderstood, and now I do understand very well what you mean. You know, I'm thinking of the social science on which the Supreme Court relied as far back as Brown v. Board of Education, which was not about self-hatred specifically, but about the terrible damage to a person's identity and sense of dignity and self-worth that can be done by what I call hateful and dangerous speech. And yes, there's a tremendous amount of literature on that.
I have an example of counter speech. I was wondering if I could show it to the group. My name is Chuck Feinberg. I'm executive director of Interfaith Action for Human Rights. And we are promoting a banner campaign for religious communities to post on their property banners that express support with Muslims. And we have several slogans. This is one of the slogans. And the other is that we stand with our Muslim neighbors. And I have flyers in the back, and I ask you if you're interested, you can contact me. There's flyers, and you can order it for your community. We have two different sizes. This is 2x6, and we have a 3x9, and the prices are either $140 or $200. And we would love to see many, many different communities, religious communities, otherwise. Well, thank you. Yeah, great. display it on their property as a sign of support and as a way to counter some of the hate speech and action in our community. I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you.
I'm Jitawri. I'm from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And one thing I know, the election is coming up or going on. And so we see many dangerous speeches from the candidates. Now, they don't mean that, but they will always say something that media picks up. Media picks up these dangerous speeches. The media and the candidates both are dangerous in that way, because after the candidate is elected and they will settle down, they will not have any hatred to that group. So what I'm saying is, I wish this program was done in the Capitol Hill also, so that these politicians, they understand what dangerous speech is and what kind of effect it had to the ordinary people. And at the same time, from Ahmadiyya Muslim community, they already had a true Islam and extremism. And you can Google that, because it's www.trueislam.com. And it had freedom of speech. So in a way, it tells you what your rights are in speaking to others and to saying something. This is why I'm saying the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is very persecuted in many countries. But we never had any hate toward other people. We always love Haram and hated from them. And this is the motive that is we learned from the Islam also. And that's what I'm saying, that I wish we had in Capitol Hill, they could understand that all the people are speaking about the hate speech.
Thank you. I happen to be quite familiar with dangerous speech against Ahmadis. I'm working with some colleagues in other countries, particularly on that topic. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you, Professor, for your enlightening speech. When I see something like kill all Muslims, it makes me cringe. Just think about it. Thank you for...
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have left it up.
Are there any examples in the US of people who have been prosecuted for dangerous speech? If not, why?
There are examples, I would say. For example, I mentioned the standard in American First Amendment law for incitement to violence. That comes from a case called Brandenburg. Brandenburg v. Ohio. Brandenburg was a virulent, racist, anti-Semite, multi-target hater who gave a speech to a group of people in a field in Ohio, calling for appalling violence against various groups. He was prosecuted and convicted under an Ohio state law. He appealed his conviction up to the United States Supreme Court and was acquitted under this standard that such speech is a crime only if there is a probability of imminent lawless action. And in the case of his speech, no one reacted with violence. And so, of course, this is another thing about the criminal law. By the time the case gets to court, the judges always know whether there was or wasn't violence in response to the speech. So Brandenburg's conviction was overturned, but he was prosecuted. You asked me whether there have been prosecutions, and that's one. There have indeed been many prosecutions. However, just to make sure I've been clear, I want to say that dangerous speech as such is not a crime. I hope that answers your question. Yes? We've just 2 minutes, so I think I saw 2 other questions. Maybe we can quickly, or perhaps you could ask those 3 questions and I'll answer as briefly as I can.
My understanding is dangerous speech is as free speech. So you could promote dangerous speech, but it's covered as free speech because we have that for First Amendment, so we can say whatever we want as long as people are killing each other. So I just want to have some clarification if it is dangerous speech is a free speech.
So you could say something dangerous under United States First Amendment law as long as it is not probable that people will react violently soon after you speak. That is this idea of imminent lawless action. There's a good chance of imminent lawless action in response to your speech, then it's not legal. So the gentleman asked, how do you measure that? And that's an outstanding question. Judges would, I suppose, look at the context. Maybe using some 5 factors. No, I'm just kidding. That's not part of American law. They would look at the context and try to make a guess. However, in practice, as I said, judges don't usually have to do that because by the time a case arrives in court, they know whether there was violence or not in response to somebody's speech. Especially since the standard is imminent lawless action. Then the question is, would there be or was there violence immediately after somebody spoke? And by the time a case reaches court, you don't have to make a guess anymore. They always know in retrospect whether there was or there wasn't. Does that make sense? And then over this, yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something that was in the paper last week about a student from Egypt who was Muslim who made a Facebook post in response to Donald Trump's hateful, we call it dangerous rhetoric, and he said on Facebook, I wouldn't mind serving a life sentence for killing Donald Trump. The world would be better off. Just a kid making a stupid comment on Facebook. Well, he's been deported. So that's why I'm a strong defender of free speech, because often what happens is the people on, quote, our side are the ones who are prosecuted.
Yeah, I should say this Brandenburg standard with imminent lawless action is not the only kind of speech that is illegal in the United States. It is also illegal to make what are called true threats, and there are various other categories of speech, including in some circumstances obscenity, that are, and certain, for example, child pornography is also, of course, illegal. So there are various other kinds of speech that are also illegal under U.S. law. I think perhaps my time is up.
Just one more question.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bennett. I want to apologize for having to cut the questioning so that we have appropriate time for all of our speakers. I also want to remind you all that when you're asking questions, try to ask a question. That way, everyone else can also have time to ask the questions that they would like to address with the speakers. I want to just highlight a couple things that Ms. Benish spoke about, as well as Reverend Stowe. I kind of wanted to give you guys full time to be able to talk, but I want to just first echo what Reverend Stowe said about, with Martin Luther King Jr., that we fear each other because we don't know each other, and that's because we're separated from each other. I thought that was a very poignant comment by Martin Luther King Jr., who at the time didn't have the research to show that if people come in contact with those that they really hate and fear, they actually change their minds. It's the single most important indicator. We know that by the Pew Research poll. I also wanted to complete MLK's beautiful quote that was up on the Twitter feed that Ms. Benish so articulately showed us, of a young woman responding to a teenager who was very angry and using the N-word and whatnot. And Martin Luther King Jr. did say darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. But the second part I think is really important because it shows why it was effective. He says, hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And so she was showing this man love by asking him, would your mom be okay with this? And she realized that this is probably an angry, tormented young man who had lost his mother. And that kind of sort of reaching out to one another is the kind of thing I think that makes us less separated, as you so eloquently put, Reverend Stowe. And finally, I just want to kind of readdress the most important takeaways, we'll say, from Ms. Benish's speech about education and the counter-messaging that we need. So inoculation to create less fear with each other, then you create more understanding with one another. And hopefully that's something that we are going to lead into our next speaker. And he is all about education, and specifically at the Anti-Defamation League, his work helps, sorry, she's putting up your presentation right now. His work helps with students who are bullied and students who are victims of hate speech. And specifically, he's the Education Project Director at the Anti-Defamation League's Washington, D.C. regional office. And he has worked with numerous educational institutions to help fight this kind of bigoted speech. He also oversees 2 Holocaust education programs for the D.C. regional office. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Seth Gordon-Litkin.
Thank you. So while we get logged into the computer, I will reiterate how grateful I am, as everyone else has already so eloquently said, to be here tonight. It's really an honor to be in a room of people who are so committed, so driven to try and stomp out some of the hateful rhetoric that we hear. And as Reverend Stowe put it so eloquently earlier, I see every day firsthand how a lot of this rhetoric is making its way from the campaign trail into the classroom. And it is genuinely horrifying in many ways, but I also want to share that there are signs for hope in this troubling climate that we're in right now with regard to hateful rhetoric and hate speech. I'll share just a quick anecdote that you can actually find in an Associated Press story that came out just yesterday, which is about Montgomery Blair High School, not too far from here. Back in December, I was contacted because we have a group of students there who are focused on training their peers with peer-to-peer education to combat bias and prejudice within the school, within the classrooms. And this group, along with the Muslim Students Association, were keenly aware of the fact that there were problems within the hallways of Muslim students being mistreated, particularly young women wearing hijab, because they were very clearly Muslim and other students were picking on them for harassment, for name-calling, for ridicule. And these students came together with this peer training group that we at the ADL have formed at Montgomery Blair to create a town hall to talk about Islamophobia and to better educate their peers about Islam by building bridges of understanding. That's a term that we like to use a lot. As Yasmin just was saying, we don't really understand each other, and that's where a lot of hate can really come from. But by building bridges of understanding, we're able to educate one another and to drive out hate, as Dr. King put it. So I want to spend the next 15, 20 minutes talking a little bit about how we see this playing out in schools and how we can build within young people today and within adults as well who have children in schools, how we can build allies and upstanders who can confront bias, confront hatred when they see it in the hallways. And the way that we're seeing it most frequently is through bullying, what I would call identity-based bullying. Picking out one piece of someone's identity, whether it's their religion, their race, socioeconomic status, gender, sexuality, picking one piece of that person's identity and using it to attack them. Identity-based bullying is something that we're all very familiar with, and in a little while I'll ask you to kind of think about instances from your own lives. But we want to really build allies within schools, build allies within communities. And I want to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes talking about how you can prepare yourself to be an ally to those in need, and also how you can talk to young people, to children of all ages, about how to foster a culture of allyhood within our schools. So, first questions to consider. What are your goals in addressing bullying, addressing bias? Is it to de-escalate the situation, to support a target, or to keep yourself and others from harm? These are the first things that we ask children and adults to really consider before picking a tactic, picking a strategy for addressing bias when they encounter it. Are you prepared? Are you prepared to stand up for what you believe is right and hold your ground? Are there others who can support actions? Because as we know, when addressing bias and hatred, that there is strength in numbers. Do you know what to do if you become a target yourself? And this is something that's really important to consider, especially when talking about this with your kids or grandkids, is do you know what to do if you become a target? Because that is a completely different situation than when you see someone being targeted themselves. It's a lot easier to stand up as an ally to someone in need than it is to stand up for oneself. And understanding your own safety is something that's a really important consideration when dealing with a situation of bias or bullying or encountering hatred. And lastly, are you capable of handling fallout? This is something we ask kids all the time. In a situation where you have to decide between maintaining a friendship or standing up for what's right, which side of that will you stand on? These are just kind of preliminary questions we want students to ask before they really consider if they're ready to stand up against hatred. And then what can you do? I'm going to give 5 brief explanations for these bullet points, and then we'll come back to some of these themes later on. But confronting the situation, challenging that bias in one of a number of different ways, challenging intentions. So essentially saying, what do you mean by that? Is this supposed to be funny? Because it's not. Expressing how something feels and explaining the impact of words on a person. And then finally, pointing out consequences, such as going to report to an adult in a school or to a police officer in some cases. Helping the target. This is an important way of being an ally that we talk about with kids all the time. Because sometimes it's very important to confront hatred when you see it. To stand up and say what you're saying is wrong. There are other times when supporting a target is just as important and just as empowering. Because oftentimes, targeted people are targeted frequently and don't know how to stand up for themselves or are afraid to stand up for themselves, with good reason. So sometimes supporting a target, removing them from the situation to a safe space, can be just as impactful as standing up to the hate speech immediately. Finding other allies, like I said before, there's strength in numbers. And most importantly, knowing when to report something. When it puts yourself in danger, when cyber hate is going viral, these are kind of easy situations to realize that maybe you don't have enough power in your own hands and need to find someone who can truly make a difference. And then finally, interrupting the cycle by stopping cruelty in its tracks. And this is something that can be done simply, just with facial expressions, by not laughing at that inappropriate joke, by not standing by and forwarding a viral video that's hateful. So, one graphic that we use, we call this the pyramid of hate. And this is a tool that we use to talking with students about the ability for hate to escalate. Now, I want to impress upon you before I really kind of dive into how we use this in schools and what it really means, that we don't want to say that any instance of bias will eventually turn into genocide. We know that that's not always the case. But this graphic is powerful because it demonstrates that there is a baseline. That genocide, what we all know as the most disgusting and most abhorrent demonstration of hatred by a deliberate and systematic attempt to wipe out an entire people or an entire group of people, can't exist in a vacuum. It's not something that just kind of happens. When teaching about the Holocaust, it's important for us when we're teaching it to students to understand that it's part of a longer history. That it wasn't something that just kind of sprung up out of nowhere when Hitler rose to power and only existed over the course of 10 years. That the acts that Hitler committed, that the Nazis committed, were allowed to happen, enabled by the buildup that came before it, by the escalation of hatred. And by knocking out the base, which we have here is bias, stereotyping, belittling jokes, non-inclusive language. These everyday acts of hatred, or everyday acts of exclusion, eventually lead up the pyramid to acts of prejudice, where we see bullying, name-calling, slurs and epithets, dehumanization, to discrimination, to bias-motivated violence, and then ultimately, in many extreme cases, to genocide. So we want to impress upon young people that in order to ensure that the mantra that we hear, especially when talking about the Holocaust of never again, that the way to ensure that that happens is by knocking out this level of the pyramid of hate, by stopping bias when it's first seen, by stopping it at the little everyday acts of hatred. So when talking with students about bullying especially, it's hard sometimes to conflate that with some of the more hateful things that we've seen. But in order to understand that, we want a common language for talking about it with young people, for understanding the different roles that people play in these instances. Because you can see them not just in the classroom and the hallways, but you can see them all throughout human history. In every instance of extreme hatred, extremist groups, supremacists, we see the same patterns, the same roles repeating themselves. And we break them into 4 different boxes. And we try to explain to students that everyone has played these roles in one capacity or another throughout their lives. I can remember times when I was a young person and may have been a perpetrator, may have been a target, a bystander, or a confronter, an ally. That it's not shameful that we've all been in these situations, because that is humanity. But what we do with them and the way that we try to process them and eventually move from box C at the bottom left corner, which is bystanders, into being an ally, someone who is standing up against hatred, that conscious effort and that reflection that needs to take place on our own wrongdoing in the past is an important first step in building sustainable change, in building attitudes that will allow us to build more inclusive and respectful communities. So we have sort of 6 simple ways for students to be an ally, and you have a handout about this on your table. I just want to go through this so that you can kind of take this home to your kids and explain to them how they can be an ally to students in their school who might be being bullied, or who they might see in the hallways being excluded. First thing that is very important to note is that we want to explain to students the importance of supporting a target whether they know them or not. In many cases, we might be bystanders because we simply don't know the person, we simply don't know how to stand up for them because they might not be a friend. But explain to young people that that doesn't make it any less important to stand up. This is in many ways, we're dealing with moral extremes in this case. We want you to do what's right all the time, whether it's a friend or a complete stranger. And being an ally and a confronter standing up against hatred is right. Don't participate. This goes back to what I was saying before. Not laughing at the mean jokes. Not pointing and staring at the kid in the room who's different. Telling aggressors to stop. This is where we find a distinction between being a confronter and being an ally. Those two go hand in hand, but an ally might be someone who, as I mentioned earlier, is bringing the target out of this space that's cruel, that's hateful, and putting them in a safe space, being supportive. That's being an ally. That's one way to be an ally. To be a confronter, you need to be actually standing up and telling the aggressor to stop. That can be on the spot or even later. And I believe this is something that students have seen in many cases, their own friends being an aggressor toward another student in the class. Telling your own friend is sometimes a little more difficult than telling a stranger to stop their bullying, to stop harassing another student. So being willing to either tell the aggressor who's a friend right then, immediately to stop, or pulling them aside later on is a good way to be an ally to someone who's being bullied. In some cases, students need to understand that it might not be the best or safest space for them to respond to something, and in those cases, it's important for them to understand that they can bring that to a trusted adult who can then take action. Getting to know people instead of judging them. And this goes back to some things we've already heard, that building bridges of understanding is the only true way to wipe out ignorance. For us to get to know one another and celebrate differences rather than being afraid of them and shying away is something that's important. Opening up avenues of communication. And then lastly, being an ally online. As Professor Benesch just showed us, there is unfortunately a lot of hate online these days. It is the easiest way to anonymously and without having your face on it necessarily, even if your username, your picture might be associated with, there is a degree of anonymity when we're behind a keyboard. Everyone is more courageous behind their computer monitor than they are in person. And that enables people to spew out things that they would not even be willing to say behind closed doors with other people in the room. So explaining to young people that being an ally online is just as important as being an ally in the cafeteria, on the playground, in the classroom. That our behaviors online should reflect our behaviors offline. So for those of you who have kids who are still in school, kids who are grown up and have their own kids now, there are important steps that you can take in order to prevent bullying, whether it's by your own kid or by a kid in their class. And one of the important ways to start that is to increase communication. Instead of just asking a simple, open-ended question, how was school today? Maybe make more pointed questions, such as, what happened at lunch today? Who'd you sit with? What'd you talk about? Trying to, a lot of times, and I was guilty of this when I was young, a lot of times my mom, when I'd come home for dinner, my mom would say, how was school today? Oh, it was fine. It was okay. If we can open up more honest communication and try to ask more pointed questions to find out what's going on, especially if you notice certain patterns of behavior that maybe your kid is a little closed off, maybe a little upset about something. By asking more pointed questions, you might be able to get to the bottom of what's going on and help prevent bullying in school. And that brings me to monitoring behavior. That being aware of social withdrawal, of fear of attending school, these are important signs that can be a telltale if your child is being bullied, or if they're afraid because they're witnessing so much bullying in school. Facilitating positive social experience, encouraging them to seek out extracurricular activities, friend groups, and other things away from negative situations that they might be experiencing in school are a great way to try and bolster confidence and to ensure that they'll have more positive interactions with people. Promoting responsible online behavior. Going back to my mother, who's a very wise woman, she taught me when I was about 10 years old, and AOL Instant Messenger was still a thing, that anything I was typing to someone could be shown to 100 other people. That anything could be copied and pasted and moved around wherever, or cut and pasted, and my words could be completely changed. Explain to your kids how to behave responsibly online. And that is a really difficult thing because of how much irresponsibility they're exposed to online. So trying to impress upon children at a very young age how the most constructive ways to behave on social media and on even messengers with their friends, explaining to them that anything online is not private, anything online is not secret. That is an important thing for people to understand, because I think that idea of anonymity, that idea of secrecy, is what does embolden people to put hateful messages on the internet. Talking about bullying. It's something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. They don't want to bring up the elephant in the room. Just like we're afraid sometimes to talk about our own differences amongst one another, we might be afraid to talk about the things that we encounter in life that are pretty ugly. To open up that conversation, you might be enlightened by what you hear from your kids. Of course, being a role model is important, and this is something that we should be striving to do in every aspect of our lives, not just with regard to bullying. And being involved at school. That allows parents to have a voice in what's going on within their communities, to work with the faculty, the principals at different schools to help find solutions to the problems that they're encountering. And then intervention tips, and these are also incredibly important. Offering support to your kid if they're being bullied. Engaging them in a conversation about options for responding is an important step, because sometimes students who are being bullied, who are being excluded in their social groups, might feel like there's no answer for them, like there's no way out. So trying to create that conversation to let them know that you're supportive of them and help them figure out creative ways to respond to these incidents is an important first step. Gathering information, and I think this is duly important online where everything can be easily compiled. Screenshots can be taken, posts can be saved. Gather as much information about an incident as possible so that when you are approaching this in a strategic way, trying to figure out what the best method for response might be, that you have all the information available, especially if you need to reach out to the school and explain to them what happened, and let them know what problems you've seen and witnessed and what that you believe should be done to resolve it. And if in extreme cases where safety is a major concern, law enforcement is sometimes vital contact. This is particularly true with bullying and cyberbullying behavior that could get dangerous. And that's, I think, Professor Benish so eloquently explained to us the difference between hate speech and dangerous speech. So now we all really understand when there is the potential for that incitement, and when something does need to be brought to authorities that are law enforcement officials. Helping a child to build resilience is important. One way that you can do this is identify safe and responsible adults that they can go to for help. Whether that's a guidance counselor or a teacher that they really can confide in, as well as support structures from their peers. Helping a student to learn ways of defending themselves and also of building coalition around them to respond to these incidents is critical for intervention. And then lastly, keeping your kids safe online. Work with your kids to change screen names if necessary, to make sure that their passwords are good enough that their accounts are protected and that they can't be hacked into and used for hate. And reporting serious instances. This is something that's very important. And lastly, if cyberbullying is taking place in school, that's something that's really important to bring to administration, because that means that they need better measures in place for their own networks, for their own access within their computers. So these are just a few different tactics that you can use to not only protect your kids, your grandkids, or other young people in the area, but also to create a conversation with them about how they can not only defend themselves and stand up when they see bias coming at them, but also how they can be allies to others who are targeted with hateful rhetoric and hateful speech. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions, and hopefully I will have some answers.
have with the middle school children, and of course that's a very specific age, is there is a combination of children that are ignorant of seeing bullying with others and recognizing it, and then themselves mislabeling bullying. Can you speak to the difference between bullying, legitimate, serious, bullying, and play that's misinterpreted, or misreading a social communication, because that's a huge issue. I don't know if you could speak to that.
Sure, and it's a tough distinction. I totally understand that. It's really a challenge because I think one thing that we really need to impress upon kids at that age especially is the importance of understanding context and understanding intent. And I think that might kind of get to the heart of what you're asking about. Because I believe in a way that I like to explain this to students is that when dealing with perhaps an ignorant comment, someone who might just not know better and says something that maybe they heard on the news, unfortunately on the campaign trail, that can make its way in the classroom, I think an important way to sort of frame that is to assume goodwill, assume good intent, but explain the impact. So having a student say to a peer, I understand that you may have this idea, here's why it's hurting me, here's why it's kind of cutting deep. And that is something that I think is really true now, as we all maybe have heard about what we call microaggressions, where students are saying things to one another such as, you don't look Jewish, or, what country are you really from? These kinds of statements that maybe aren't meant with ill intent, that maybe aren't meant as hateful, but can come across that way and can certainly cut to the core of the student. So I think explaining impact and assuming goodwill is an important step in making that distinction. But I think with regard to what we consider bullying, I think and the words that we use, target, aggressor, those are really clear because it is intentionally going after one target, intentionally, trying to exclude that student or to make them feel bad about themselves, ridicule them. So I think that intent is really the main distinguishing factor. Does that answer your question?
You made the comment that it was important to go to authorities if there was a serious incident, I think was the term you used. How do you define a serious incident on and offline?
I think threats are a big indicator. Whenever safety is a concern, if there is a potential for incitement to violence, that is a pretty clear indicator that you should go to law enforcement or a school resource officer. But I think safety is really the key factor in determining that. If ever there's a situation where a student is made to feel physically unsafe or that there is a potential for harm.
Thank you very much for a very detailed outlook as to what could be done in the school systems. Looking back and seeing the various toxic media that is around nowadays, what can maybe the middle schools, the high schools, and even the college administration do to try and have some programs for all students? I mean, students are trying to do something, but coming from the other way around, from the top. What can they do? What do you suggest that we can offer them?
Well, you've given me a great opportunity to do a little self-promotion. That ADL, the organization I work for, the Anti-Defamation League, does work with schools all over the DC area to try and create that sort of top-down initiative to help provide schools with step-by-step frameworks for not only explaining bias and prejudice to kids and how they manifest in society, but trying to bring that from the top down to make it so that it's an initiative the school is really behind overall. So I'm a good contact for that. You have my email address right up there. But also I think that it really is something that schools, I think there is a challenge that sometimes they don't want to bring up something that could be potentially divisive. And for some reason, unfortunately, people believe that talking about bias and prejudice is divisive. But the reality of it is that students see it around them every day, not just in the news, but in, even fictional television, fictional movies, stuff like that. It is around them every day. And I think there is a hesitancy to admit that amongst many schools. And to try and, if you have a stake in that school, whether you're a parent, a grandparent, a community leader, to bring that to the principal and say, this is an important topic for us to be addressing. It's affecting our students every single day. We need to do something about it. I think they'll be very receptive. But unless there are masses within those schools calling out for it, schools might be overprogrammed as it is, might be reluctant to put something new on their calendar because they have so many requirements from county boards and state boards that they need to fulfill. But if there is a growing voice within the school community that it is a vital topic to address, I think most principals and educators will be very receptive to that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Fred Evans. I was a high school and middle school principal, so that I want to segue into what you were saying here in Montgomery County. Dealing with these issues has to be a systemic process with the community, and I'm confirming what you said, the community, the staff, and when I say staff, I'm not just talking about the teaching staff, the administrative staff, I'm talking about all staff, cafeteria workers, building service workers, have to know what the principal's PLE are to deal with issues of bullying when they see or hear it. And I can't stress that enough, so that I totally agree with you. The parent has to be part of that process, where you do workshops and training with parents about what to do, and it can never just be based on one incident. It has to be ongoing, so that when a new staff member comes on board, there's a training process for those new staff members about here's how we handle this. And I'm not just saying, oh, here's how we handle it. It's very, 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 very serious, and folks have to know that. And students pick up on that right away, because if they see you taking action when you talk with a trusted adult, the incidents will decrease because they know that it's not going to be tolerated. So I can give you many examples, but I won't. And thank you for your presentation.
One deals with this idea that, thank you very much. I thought I heard a different question on this side over here, because one of the things that we heard our students talk about, particularly when we had our forum at the Muslim Community Center a few weeks ago, was that it was a non-response from teachers that really was a concern to these young people. And on the other side of that is this sense that, toughen up, come on, you got to toughen up, be a man, be a woman, whatever it's all right, and trying to discern which is going on at the time that comes to you from that student. I mean, what ought that teacher do in the classroom in trying to figure out what that is that's going on? So that's the first question about that. The second question then is, speak to what's happening in the workplace, not just schools where bullying is going on. Do you have any thoughts about what's going on in the workplace in terms of bullying?
So I'll speak to the workplace first and just say that that's not exactly my field. I'm really primarily working with students K through 12, but also a bit on college campuses. The workplace, you're bringing up a point that's well heard, that workplaces need better training on how to be culturally sensitive, how to, as I mentioned before, build bridges of understanding between one another. In terms of teachers, I think that there is a dire need for better training on how to respond to those things in the classroom. I can remember from my time in high school examples of teachers who were using their time in class to say things that were hateful. But because I and the students around me didn't fully understand what they were saying, we didn't do anything about it ourselves. But what we at ADL do is we try to organize trainings for educators to understand how biases develop based on who we are and the cultures we belong to and what kind of environments we grew up in, to try and get to the root of maybe some of our own biases and prejudices, and then figure out how we can build a conversation with people who are different about the impact on their own cultural identity. As it pertains to scenarios in the classroom, this is another area where we just need to find more opportunities to give teachers proper training so that they can practice in a safe space how to respond to something like that. I think there is potentially a worry amongst some teachers that they could go about it the wrong way and then face some condemnation or some punishment of their own. So I think that teachers might be a little quick to shy away from those things because maybe it's not affecting them personally, or they just don't know the best way to respond. So I think better training for teachers across the board is really a vital need for us, so that they can have a space and have opportunities to look at some real life situations and practice their responses. Because practice is really the best thing for making a positive impact in that regard. So I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but I think that training is really the key to all of this. And finding opportunities where we can open up dialogue around bias, prejudice, and discrimination, and how they manifest in the schools. Because bullying is really the way that we see it mostly within schools. But bias, prejudice, discrimination, they can come up in all sorts of ways within a school. So I hope that kind of gets to your question, but happy to talk about it more after if you like. Yes? The microphone's coming to you.
I just want to make a comment. I really appreciate the work that you all are trying to do in schools. It's really a big problem. I'm a psychiatric social worker, so I deal a lot with people in various ages, and inevitably there'll be people in their 50s and 60s even, and they'll talk about their childhood, and one of the things that they'll bring up a lot of times is bullying, and how they were bullied as a child. Years later, it's affecting them and has had a big impact. So it's so important the work that's being done to really counteract that. So I appreciate it. I just wanted to make that comment.
Hi, my name is Hannah, and I'm 16, and I am a sophomore at Churchill High School. First of all, I just wanted to commend Seth. I've actually done a lot of work with ADL and done their National Youth Leadership mission. But I was just asked to speak to kind of add like a student perspective to all of this. And I think everything that's been said is very valid, but something that's very important to consider is that a lot of this is just the culture of high school. And that there is a stigma around speaking not only about bullying, but also how it leads to mental health. I think the biggest thing is overturning that culture and changing that culture. And I think, although it is easy to talk about, the action steps are, something that we really have to focus on. And like simple things like that I've seen in my school are, just when we're talking about identity and getting people to students to be able to be proud of their identity and not have to compromise it into a uniform thing. And I think a definite thing that I would want to just mention is mental illness, because I think that's something that is often overlooked, especially with the effects of bullying and mental illness that I've seen all across high school. So thank you.
I like the fact that this is going on in schools. I also view this as kind of an end product So going back to where that comes from, and a part of it is mental issue, maybe that may be part of what biases are, but there's also the big race elephant in the room. How are we handling the race part of this? Because that's where it all comes from, where then people get uncomfortable, they don't know what to do, and then all this stuff comes out, and then bullying is the solution or a help for us, but we have to handle the race issue first.
And that's a crucial part of what we do before we even get to responding to bullying is understanding what makes each of us unique. And obviously a part of that is race, a part of that is religion, a part of that is nationality, you know, one of a million different identity groups that we can be a part of. But creating a conversation, and one of the tactics that we use for this it's a graphic called the identity molecule, where we ask students to essentially put in a circle, in a molecule, 5 different groups that they consider themselves a part of. That could be, you know, in my case, so I'm Jewish, I'm in my 20s, I'm a young urban professional, and so these kinds of identity groups that we all possess, and come from whatever's most important to us. And we ask students to open up with someone around them about what they consider that day to be the primary identity that they're carrying with them. And to open up with someone about a time when that identity has caused them great pride, and a time when that identity has caused them great pain. And it's really remarkable to see students who will be willing to open up in a space that we create as a safe space where they can share and be confident that they won't be judged, that they'll open up about those exact kinds of issues that they encounter every day. And having those conversations by asking people just to simply talk about who they are and how it's impacted their life on a day-to-day basis really does create bridges of understanding, if I can go back to that catchphrase for the dozenth time. Yeah?
Latino, faith community, Jewish, Muslim. Do you have recommendations for how we pull these groups that are kind of fighting these fights all by themselves and creating coalitions? Do you have any advice of all these, projects that you've done? That how do you build that kind of momentum for groups to cooperate and do these things together?
I think that there needs to be a shared goal. To go back to the example, the anecdote I shared earlier about the town hall against Islamophobia at Blair, that was a case where Muslim students felt that they were being targeted in the school, and they were seeking allies. They were seeking, others who could help them educate. And they went to the ADL peer training group, who aren't all Muslim, who come from really diverse backgrounds that represent diversity within their school. And they said, can you help us facilitate this conversation? And it was incredibly successful because at the front of the room, at this panel, it wasn't just the people who were being targeted sharing their experience, but also people who said, I saw this and I thought that we needed to make a difference somehow. I think that they're all too often, like you said, I was in the Jewish Student Union. I knew kids who were in the Muslim Student Association or the Christian Culture Club in my school. But they never interacted. So creating opportunities to say, all are welcome here, to say, we are having an event about, it could be Jewish eating ritual, something like that, Come eat with us. Everyone likes to eat, right? We're all here, we're all eating. So I think there's just finding common interests, common ground to stand on that can be something really simple that might not have anything to do with our religion, with our race. It might just be something, a hobby we all like to do, a sport we like to play, something like that allows us to come together and bring groups that maybe think to themselves that they're different from one another under a common tent.
I have a microphone here.
I promise to say
yeah, I'll make a professional plug, because what we hear
feel they're not prepared to handle that kind of activity in school. And I think there's a profession that has kind of been left out to some extent. School social work. I think that is, you know, not every school has a social worker, but I would really like to give a plug, because that will also address some of the soft mental health issues, and people that are prepared to work with groups, that would be prepared to work with teachers and administrators. So I'd just like to give a shout out for social work. This is Social Work Month, and really encourage educators to think about hiring more social workers. Thank you.
Thank you all again. It's really been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seth. That was so enlightening and analytical. It's a really nice framework. I loved but hated the hate pyramid, or the pyramid of hate that you know, just so beautifully spelled out for us. And I think that we can all recognize the bias and the individual acts of discrimination that are kind of at the base of that triangle before that bias, violence, the violence that's predicated on that bias, and then of course the ultimate, which is the genocide. So I wanted to just get everybody to stand up a little bit and stretch, because I know we're tired. And we really want to be awake for this next and final speaker. And while you guys are stretching, I will say a couple words. And that is that, you know, when I was in middle school, I was just thinking about how middle school is such a weird time. As a teacher who spoke about kind of, in middle school it's very difficult to read social cues for a lot of people. It's very difficult to know the truth from falsity. And I remember being in 6th grade and reading the very powerful, provocative poem that was written by Pastor Martin Niemöller, where he said, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unions, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Thank you. No problem. You don't have to clap for the poem. Please try to have a seat after you get maybe some refreshments. But I just wanted to explain that I am a product of, I was a high school student when September 11th happened, but I grew up in Alabama, in the middle of the South. And we had one Jewish girl in our entire school. I remember her. Her name was Carol. And I remember being in middle school before September 11th ever happened. And it was such a racially charged place that this poor girl, Carol, was being attacked for the same reason that I was being attacked, that she was different. So me wearing a headscarf was attacked just as much as Carol was for being Jewish and not celebrating Christmas. So I remember Ryan being in the cafeteria when I decided to stand up and stop the aggression, like Seth so beautifully presented to us. And specifically, I remember coming into the lunchroom, and he had called me a raghead, and he had called her a word that I cannot repeat, but it was a very derogatory term that is used for Jewish Americans. And I remember looking at him and saying, and sitting down and moving his tray, like this, out of his way. And he looked at me and said, "Are you crazy?" I said, "No, you've got the problem. I've never disrespected you. Why are you disrespecting me and Carol?" He looked at me and said, "What?" I said, "I know what you said." So what do you mean? I said, "Well, if you're not a coward, why don't you say it to my face now?" And he's like, "No, I didn't say anything." I said, "You said this, and you said that." And I called out exactly what he had called both me and Carol. And I said, "She's never done anything to you, and I've never done anything to you." And I remember him shaking at that moment, because he had been called out. And it's very difficult in middle school. I was in 7th grade. It's very difficult in middle school to have a group of friends that you can trust. He was a popular kid. He was a kid that was popular based on the fact that other kids feared him, and that, you know, he made fun of multiple people. And this was the first time someone was calling him out and not scared of him at all. not showing any fear, not showing any intimidation from his behavior. And he was also somebody who played sports. In the South, if you play football, if you play basketball, you are considered a certain kind of elite sort of student. And I remember, he tried to kind of get in a word in edgewise. I said, hey, I said, you should actually shut up because it's my turn to talk now. I said, the way that this works is that I talk and you listen because you've done enough talking. The next time I hear that you say anything about me or Carol, you better believe that you'll have to mess with me. And I remember her, she started crying. Carol started crying because she could not believe this was happening. And he started crying because he couldn't believe that this was happening to him. And that friendship was a very important friendship for me when we went into high school together, me and Carol, because we ended up in the same high school. And I remember thinking in that moment that if I don't speak out for the people who are marginalized, people who are different than me, believe different things, they have a different hair, skin, color, ethnicity, interests, that at some point, no one was going to be left to speak out for me. And that this sort of bullying, unfortunately, scares people into silence. And especially in middle school or at the beginning of high school where you feel very unsure about who you are. And so I just wanted to thank Seth for his really powerful talk. I hope that students really internalize what he was talking about, which is, how do you support the target? How do you not participate? How do you tell the aggressors to stop? How do you potentially have to inform a trusted adult? And how do you get to know people and not judge them and to be an ally and creating this, what he said, the culture of allyship. And I hope that we can all, tell our children, our grandchildren, our sisters, our brothers, that they should not be afraid of the social fallout that will happen. And it will happen. A social fallout will happen by calling out hate. But then you'll gain something, and that's respect. So although there was a social fallout because, okay, maybe I'm not going to be the popular girl because I just called out a very popular guy, I would gain my colleagues' respect over time. So, thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Stephen Cohen, and he is a communications specialist. So I wish I would have known him back then. Maybe he would help me communicate my ideas in a less intense way of throwing Ryan's food on the ground. He is the leader of communication of the Counter Extremism Project, which is an organization that has offices in New York, Brussels, Berlin, London, and it helps combat extremism by pressuring financial support networks and countering the extremist narrative. He is a journalist originally, and an award-winning one at that, and before that he spent 10 years on Capitol Hill doing legislative and communications directing. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Stephen Cohen.
Did everybody get a chance to stretch? I'll give you 30 more seconds, maybe. I know what it's like to sit for a long time. Tonight I want to talk to you. First I want to thank everybody who preceded me. I think both of those presentations were fantastic and full of good information and really give us something to go home and contemplate. I want to talk a little bit tonight, though, about the internet and internet safety and what the Counter-Extremism Project is and what it's doing in terms of extremism on the internet. Because I want to ask you at the end of this, I want to ask you to do something. This struggle against violent extremism is sometimes, to those of us who are parents, can feel like it's happening invisibly. Because we are not digital natives, because we don't live on Twitter or other forms of social media, we might not understand that this world is out there. But I can tell you that it absolutely is. And tonight I want to talk about how the internet is being misused by extremists to radicalize, to recruit, and to incite violence. I'm going to give you some examples. are extremist groups that are doing the most, and they've been the most effective. But the Counter-Extremism Project looks at extremism of all types, shapes and sizes, and tries to eliminate the worst types of extremism from the internet. But tonight I'm going to talk a little bit mostly about ISIS. And I'm going to talk about social media companies, because social media companies are, for the most part, US companies. But online misuse has global consequences. And we need to do more as a society. We need to build a constituency that convinces or forces social media companies to do more in this area to battle violent extremism. Let's see if this works. Okay. Don't try to read that. I'm sorry, there's probably too much on here. But I wanted to tell you something about who we are. We were launched in 2014. Our headquarters is in New York. But like was mentioned, we have a presence in Washington. My colleague Alan Goldsmith is here with me tonight. This is our Washington office, Alan and I. And our headquarters, as I said, is in New York. But we have offices in Brussels, in London, and we should be opening an office in Germany in the very near future. We also have trained people around the world where we get information from, and I'll allude to that later on. The three things that we try to do most is we're building a best-in-class clearinghouse of extremist groups and leaders. You can go to our website, counterextremism.com, and you can learn a great deal, as much as you care to know, about extremist groups, everything from Al-Qaeda and ISIS to the KKK to right-wing extremist groups in Europe like Jobbik and like Golden Dawn in Greece. We try to pressure the financial and networks of extremist groups. Extremist groups exist for two reasons. They have to have recruits, they have to have bodies, and they have to have money. If they don't have either of those things, or if they don't have enough of either of those things, they start to wither. And obviously that's our goal, to do both of those things. Some of you might have seen an ABC News program or an ABC News feature in October that asked a very simple question. How come when we see ISIS convoys, where did ISIS get all those brand new Toyota trucks? It sounds like a simple thing, but we initiated that investigation. We looked at all of these films and we said, where are all these Toyota trucks coming from? This group can't operate this way without all of this transportation. So where are these trucks coming from? So ABC did this great story, and we're still working on it. Hopefully there'll be a follow-up, but I guarantee, although we in no way implicated Toyota for providing these trucks, I guarantee Toyota has tightened up their supply chain, because certainly somebody was buying these trucks. These trucks were getting into ISIS-held territory very easily. Then the third thing is digital disruption and counter-narrative. What we're trying to do basically is to clamp down on the kinds of very violent rhetoric and recruitment propagandizing that's going on, mostly on Twitter, but as you'll see on on YouTube as well, because we want to create space for counter-narratives to grow. There are so many great programs here in Montgomery County and other places that are just being drowned out. In September, we sponsored something called the Global Youth Against, the first Global Youth Summit Against Violent Extremism. We brought together more than 100 youth activists from all over the world. The State Department participated, the White House was a sponsor, Facebook and Microsoft participated in that as well. And what we heard from these youth activists, many of whom had their own programs in their own communities, was we are losing this battle because we cannot get our voices heard. That ISIS and what they're saying is so prevalent, is so overwhelming, that it is very hard for us to operate. So, very quickly, some of our leadership. The CEO is Mark Wallace. He was a former ambassador of the United Nations for Management Reform. Joseph Lieberman, who I'm sure most of you have heard of, a very distinguished senator from Connecticut. Fran Townsend was President Bush's Homeland Security advisor. And Dennis Ross, a former State Department employee who was very famous for his Middle East peace negotiation efforts. This is just some of the kinds of coverage we've gotten. I should have probably not done this so much. Give you a little background on extremism. I think that ISIS as a whole came into the world as a huge shock. They just swept across, for a variety of reasons. They were able to sweep across Syria and Iraq, and the battle we're fighting with them is really two-tiered. We're fighting this battle with bullets and bombs, and we're fighting this battle online because their ability to recruit people has just been unbelievable. The most recent and authoritative study of ISIS online, or ISIS on Twitter, estimated there were between 35,000 and 70,000 ISIS supporters on Twitter, tweeting messages at about a rate of 200,000 a day. And on top of that, and that's no accident, because they have a very sophisticated multimedia organization that covers not only recruitment, but the way they reach out on social media, the way they target people, and that's also reflected in their videos and how they distribute them. We have somebody who totaled up, and they've released more than 1,100 videos in the time since 2014, since they basically burst on the scene. And I'm sure you've seen stories about some of them. Some of them are really horrific, and you've heard about the beheading videos, you've heard about the immolation videos, and all of this violence. Well, to some people, that violence has been just an enormous draw. But there have been a lot of other videos that have concentrated more on recruiting women by talking about what life is like in the caliphate, about this utopia that you should join and you should come to, and it's been very effective, unfortunately. So all of these videos have been very sophisticated and very segmented, and it's all by design, and it's all been very effective. I want to talk about a few. According to the FBI, there are about 250 Americans who have either joined or tried to join extremist groups overseas. At CEP, on our website, we have profiles of about 90. All you can say about these people, they come from different parts of the country. They're different ages. They have different backgrounds. They have different religions. But the one thing that draws them together is their use of social media and how social media affected their belief system and how it was successful in bringing them, in radicalizing them, and getting them to do what the extremists wanted them to do. The guy on the left, Christopher Cornell, very quiet kid, graduated from high school in 2012, was working, living with his parents in the basement. Everybody said he was this quiet, kept to himself. Well, Christopher Cornell was arrested for planning attacks with pipe bombs and firearms on the U.S. Capitol. He was arrested in January of 2015, and he's going to stand trial. So. The second guy, Ali Shirkri-Amin, was an honor student in Manassas, Virginia. He created a pro-ISIS site, Twitter site. He used other forms of social media as well. He was successful in promoting ISIS to the point where he got people to join ISIS. He was in touch with ISIS recruiters regularly. And in June, he's at the age of 17, unfortunately, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Then there's Jocelyn Young, an honor student at Mississippi State University studying to be a doctor, the daughter of a Mississippi police officer, and suddenly out of nowhere, well, probably wasn't out of nowhere, but somewhere along the line, she became exposed to ISIS material, became radicalized, and she and her fiance were arrested and trying to leave the country and move to Syria. This is a little graph that talks a little bit about how this process sometimes works. Usually the first place that people get exposed to radical content is on Twitter. We call Twitter, at CP, we call Twitter the gateway drug. Twitter doesn't like that, but we keep doing it anyway. We do it in congressional testimony, they don't like that either. And then, many times, when the relationship has been developed, and somebody has gotten interested in the group, the conversations move over to another more secure site like AskBook or AskFM, and then eventually to another kind of encrypted site like Kik, where instructions on how to get to Syria, or how to get out of your house, and how to make your way away from outside the United States and to the Caliphate, to the Muslim utopia, how that can be done. I brought along a sanitized version of some of the tweets that we have called out and tried to get these people taken down from Twitter. And just understand, I'm sure you understand this, but Twitter's, one of the challenges with Twitter, is that people can get taken down but come back, and especially people like this, and try to rebuild their networks very, very carefully, very quickly. But these are some of the kinds of tweets that caused us to demand from Twitter to take down some of these authors. Like the one, as you can see, President Obama is having his skull impaled with a knife. And they're all very alarming. But as you can imagine, these are being retweeted thousands and thousands of times. Some of our campaign has generated a lot of impressions. We've grown our network to about 19,000 followers, and we get people to retweet when we call out somebody. This is an example of another thing that we're trying to do on YouTube. Anwar al-Awlaki was an American-born cleric that became a high official of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. These are people who were either directed by him to carry out attacks, or people who were inspired by him. The San Bernardino killers watched Anwar al-Awlaki videos for hours each day, according to his friend. The Boston Marathon bomber was inspired. The underwear bomber who in 2009 tried to detonate a bomb on a flight from Europe to Detroit was sent by Anwar al-Awlaki, and the Fort Hood shooter was in direct contact with Anwar al-Awlaki. Now, Anwar al-Awlaki was ordered killed by President Obama in 2001, but through the miracle of YouTube, you can search for Anwar al-Awlaki, get 60,000 of his videos, and through YouTube's own automatic algorithms, you are automatically directed to his most violent, most extremist videos all the time. We had an op-ed in USA Today on January 25th where we called for YouTube to do something to take all these videos down, because there's no way to separate the non-violent from the violent videos, and you get directed that way anyway. As was mentioned, we took our CP Digital Disruption program to Europe. We are now monitoring tweets in Turkish, Arabic, Italian, French, and German, and we brought this campaign to get social media companies to do more to take these people down to the European Parliament, and that is an ongoing thing. We've testified in Congress many times, and we think that there is a good chance that there is going to be something in Congress. There's a bill right now that's modeled after the bill that prevents child pornography from being the kind of nuisance that it used to be. Basically, there's a law that tells social media companies and internet companies if they see something that looks like that child pornography, they are by law required to report it to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There is legislation like that. Senator Feinstein has. It was introduced last Congress. It didn't go anywhere, but we think it has more chance this year. And what we think is eventually there might be that same parallel type of solution in terms of dangerous online violent rhetoric and other messages that are part of the Twitter sphere and on social media. The reason that child pornography is easily found and eliminated is because there is a software program that identifies it. And we think that in terms of videos and photographs, there can be that same kind of finite online identification system, and that eventually we can then eliminate a great deal of this type of material, so that counter-narratives and so that the internet is a friendlier and safer place for people like your children and grandchildren to operate. What am I going to ask you to do? Well, very simple things. You can go to our website and you can follow Fight Extremism, our Twitter site, and you can retweet things that we tweet if we are asking Twitter to take down people. You can send us the hashtag or the address of someone you think is violating the terms of service of Twitter and is advocating violence or direct threats or inciting to violence, and we can then contact Twitter and do this very thing. Or the simplest thing is to go to our website and to sign our petition to ask Twitter to take action and hold people accountable for the misuse of their platform. We think that we're making progress. You know, when we started this, nobody talked about the dangers of online extremism. Now the White House is reaching out to tech companies and trying to work on counter-narratives. People have come to realize that this has real impacts on the safety of people in America. People have been incited to carry out lone wolf attacks. People have done all sorts of things being directed from thousands of miles away by a very sophisticated network. So we think things are moving in our direction and toward a safer internet, but not fast enough. So we want you to, one, sign the petition and talk about this kind of thing because it's out there and your kids know about it, and we want your children to be safe, and we want people like, groups like ISIS to have a much harder time in recruiting and certainly inspiring people to carry out acts of violence against Americans and other peace-loving peoples around the world. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. One of the things that occurred to me, and I didn't have a chance to ask Ms. Badesh, if I pronounced it correctly, earlier, she talked about political correctness, which is a cultural sense that limits dangerous and hate speech. However, the current political candidates are being supported in particular for violating those standards and telling it like it is. And they're deriving a great deal of strength from it. And then the Twitter social media that you're talking about is serving as an alternative truth. Because clearly the mainstream media does not advocate all this in America. All the major media outlets are talking about, you know, the reality of the extremist world. And I'm wondering where we're going in the future when the internet provides so many truths that people are left to kind of choose the outlet that supports what they want to believe. And my concern, and I guess my question is, you know, as a parent and as an educator, what are we supposed to teach children? Because if there is such widespread distrust of the mainstream media, of the network television programs and things of that nature, and they are therefore seeking information on the social media, where they are therefore extremely susceptible to slick media productions and things like that, what exactly are we supposed to tell kids as a teacher and as a parent when it comes to kind of getting involved with preventing this from happening, the radicalization?
Very good question. One, I think that, for one, I think everybody should talk to their kids about what they see. I know Penny takes her kids' phones away from her as soon as they walk in the door. I think the first step is to make sure that you speak to your kids and maybe identify, listen to what they are hearing and seeing on the internet, and then try to identify counter-narratives in your own home or in your schools, and have, you know, accurate information about what they're hearing that is going on in the world. A lot of these people who left the United States to either join al-Shabaab in Somalia or join ISIS in Syria, they got information that was obviously inaccurate, but there wasn't a lot of more accurate information. And so they became convinced by this narrative. Now, hopefully some of that is changing, but unless we can clear a space, and everybody's trying to do this, from the White House to us, to 100 community groups in different states, unless we can create some space where the truth can live, and where we have the time and attention, and sometimes this might be through the use of better spokespeople. You know, we started the Counter-Extremism Project because we knew that it wasn't just the government's problem to fight extremist ideology, that there was room for nonprofit groups and the private sector. But sometimes the government is not the great messenger, and sometimes we're not the great messenger, but the people closest to the people who are at risk are the best messengers, people who are trusted, or people who kids who might be searching will look up to. So I think all of those things, it's very, very difficult. I've heard a lot of explanations about what characteristics allow people to be drawn to this life? And they're all true to some extent, but it's very, very difficult to precisely predict when that's going to happen. But if we have our eyes open and we have community groups and we have parents who try to be aware, even though they're handicapped because they don't operate on social media, but if they try to be aware and they talk to their kids and they listen, I think that's a big step forward. I hope I... Yes, sir.
Excuse me, hi, very great presentation, thank you. Can you explain the paradox of working with Twitter? On one hand, they're the enemy, on the other hand, you're enabling us to get into Twitter at the same time. Twitter last month, as you're aware, disabled 125,000 accounts. Great headline, great story. You're saying it's not enough. What is enough, and when do you use the carrot and when do you use the stick to enable the objectives of CEP?
Well, I just want to point out that every time Twitter has taken positive action, we have issued a statement, applauding that. Now, they've had a couple of these big announcements that they've taken a lot down. But what we would say is, we'll see what happens, what the impact is that. Is there going to be a positive, permanent impact, or all these people are going to come back online with slightly different names and rebuild their networks? Twitter, we've asked Twitter for a meeting, we've asked Twitter a lot of things. At first, they were dismissive entirely. Now, they understand because there's pressure building. They see it and they're doing some positive things. But they still don't proactively take people down. They don't have enough people who are manning their sites so when complaints come in, they act quickly. As opposed to Facebook, which has really gone at this in a big way, and is not only taking things down proactively, but they're looking for things, and they're sponsoring events and counter narratives, and trying to enable people to create counter narratives on their site. Twitter's doing still the least that they can do, and hiding behind the First Amendment. We don't believe there's a First Amendment right to tweet in this country, but they obviously do. But we think we're making progress, and I think that we hope that they come around. We would like to have trusted reporting status, for example, groups like ours, so that when we report someone on Twitter, it gets quicker action. It doesn't get just put at the end of the line. They've done things that we forced them to do. They changed their terms of service. They now recognize direct threats and encouraging terrorism as two things that they don't allow. They're doing a lot more, again, in terms of discouraging violence against women, largely because there was a constituency to that, and they could see their ad revenue draining away as women were leaving in disgust, because they wouldn't put up with that kind of abuse. We're trying to build that same kind of constituency against violent extremism on Twitter to be more effective.
Unfortunately, we're beset by threats and terror, both externally and internally, and I'm interested in whether your organization addresses the internal threats of terror from neo-Nazis and the kind of hate and, I guess, organizations that produce the person that killed the Charleston 9, that the Southern Poverty Law Center have identified a number of agencies. Do you address that?
Yes, we are monitoring Twitter for that type of hate speech, that type of threat and violence. I can say we have some, as I said in my opening remarks, we have a threat report on the KKK, and we're finishing up one on the conservative citizens, CCC. The type of organized violent extremism on Twitter that's propagated by ISIS is not exactly the same. They're not those groups, those white supremacist or white nationalist groups, largely don't, at least on Twitter as we find, they're a bit more, they're not as, they don't have as much of a unified message, but they're just as dangerous. We're monitoring them. We think that their traffic on Twitter has increased during this election season. It's hard to compare apples to oranges in that way. We need a bit more data over a longer period of time to see if we can, a sense of growth in belonging to those organizations versus just holding those beliefs. A lot of these groups over the years have become more decentralized, but it's true that in the United States, there are about the same number, since 9/11, the same number of people have been killed by white supremacists or white nationalists, or however you want to term them, has been killed by Islamic extremists. So both of those things are horrible. We want to do something. We want social media to do something about both of them. But the amount of traffic and the organization and the sophistication of a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda on social media is far greater right now than the KKK or the CCC. But yes, we're concerned and we're monitoring them every day. Yes, sir.
My name is Gary Abnett. I'm an African American student, and I'm just to say I support our efforts here because all good is good. We all good, we all find ourselves. We all do good, we all find ourselves in the same place. But you touched on a very sensitive issue, and I don't know how to address it without seeming like I'm sympathizing someone who was, I can't get to
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, just wanna, it was the, I'm not privy to how the Obama administration came to conclude that Anwar al-Awlaki's words were too dangerous for him to continue to live. What I would say is that, just recently, I'm not a student of Anwar al-Awlaki. I know that he probably had many sermons that had nothing to do with violence. But it's clear that the government of the United States came to the conclusion that he encouraged and facilitated violence as an officer of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which they considered actually the most dangerous group. He started their online magazine. He taught people how to make bombs in their kitchens. I know that he can be a complex character. I would suggest, just recently, after banning Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, that they're now publishing it, but it's a heavily annotated book that scholars have inserted a lot of information that provides context and analysis to Hitler's words to try to cope with the fear that by publishing this book again after 70 years, that this might incite violence and right-wing violence. I know it's a difficult thing, but just given and Anwar al-Awlaki's videos are available on more than just YouTube, but they're available en masse on YouTube, and some of the most violent rhetoric is available on YouTube, and YouTube's own algorithms make that even more likely. So it's our position that even though that he probably has many sides, he may have started as one thing, but when he was killed by a drone strike in 2011, he might have been something very different, and he continues to inspire violence from the grave, and we think that it would be a prudent thing to do to try to at least reduce access to some of his more violent works.
Hi, I'd like to ask you about a program which I see from your brochure that you have been involved in, and that's the CVE program, Countering Violent Extremism. And I have seen that that federal program has tried to get school teachers to classify their kids by race, ethnicity, religion, nationality, in order to determine how susceptible they are to violent extremism. That certainly raised my eyebrows. And also your statement, we don't believe there's a First Amendment right to tweet. Now that may have just been glib on your part, but I couldn't disagree more. And so I would also agree with the person over here that there are problems in this country. There have been 16 people here in the state of Maryland who have died in police custody since 2004. And I think if they were still alive, they might ask you to pay more attention to violent extremism here at home, as well as to the First Amendment. Thank you.
To your question about this program, I'm not familiar with that, and we're not involved in any local countering violent extremism programs. I'd love to talk to you a bit more.
Okay. I think there's a lot of misconception about CVE programs, especially domestically. I'm involved in many of them, and actually this program is a CVE initiative of the Department of Justice. So I think there's a lot of fear about what CVE means, and I think, like everything else, it's up to the community to take back what those terms mean. And so it's very important that we don't allow others or inaccurate information to define what we will think a program is about, but actually really understand what a program is about. So as far as I understand, and there's actually a State Department official here, somebody State Department official here too, that none of the programs have ever asked teachers to define children by their ethnicity or their race or their religion to determine vulnerability. And I mean, I can tell you that from the plethora of programs that I've been involved in. That's very different than what he just said, is defining all children in school by their race and ethnicity and religion. It was asking about if there was a particular student and an ethnic community that has, that it is actually the largest radicalized group of people in the entire country from that particular community. So it was a particular local concern. It's not Somali kids all over the United States. No, absolutely it is. Absolutely it is.
That federal officials talked to the school district in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and created a program specifically targeting the Somali students in the school, as if the Somali community was the problem. And it's not an entire community. When you paint an entire community as susceptible to radicalization, that's a very big problem in the United States, because it's not Muslims, it's not people of a particular religion or ethnicity who are susceptible to radicalization. And it is something in Minneapolis. But another problem is getting the information about the tourism program, which is hard to get for justice. So we'd like to follow that. I guess that's why there is misunderstanding.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for your eye-opening presentation, especially in showing that many different types of people can be radicalized with all sorts of different types of backgrounds and religiosity levels, ethnicities, etc. I also really appreciate the conversation. It's good that we're having this dialogue. It's really important that we have different thinkers and people from different perspectives to come and dialogue about these types of things in civil and respectful ways. And I think that's what WORD stands for, and all of the co-sponsors would probably agree. I do want to share, again, our hashtags, which are hashtag Take It Down and hashtag Digital Disruption, if you've heard anything that you would want to tweet about. I also want to remind everyone to fill out the brief survey that should be on all of your tables in order for WORD and all the co-sponsors to make even better events for you in the future. I also want to plug WORD's cyber civility curriculum. So they have an actual curriculum for students so that they can dialogue with one another in respectful ways and to recognize hateful rhetoric and biased rhetoric that is online. And you can get access to the cyber civility curriculum for students by talking to one of the staff members at WORD. I also just want to quickly note that all of our speakers, I think, had very important pieces of information for us to take away. And I'll just take 1 minute of your time to kind of go through what first Ms. Susan Benish had talked to us about, which is, that we really have to think about hate speech when we think about the speaker, the audience, the content, the context, and the means of the dissemination. When she talked about that kind of paradigm, that multifaceted factorial approach to understanding what dangerous speech really means. And she defined it as anything that increases the risk of attacking one another. We should always be able to call that out, whether it comes from domestic terrorist groups, whether it comes from international terrorist groups, and all of that is extremist hate speech, and we should stand against it because it is dehumanizing. Also, she talked about specific tools, which are education, obviously to create less fear amongst one another, and to inoculate ourselves from such speech, and also counter-speech and counter-narrative attempts. And I will just sort of connect that with Stephen Cohen's presentation now, because a part of trying to control the space to make sure that people who are not basically inciting to crime or inciting to violence are stopped. And so they actually tie very well with one another. And she did speak about how censorship and punishment can sometimes cause opposite effects. And we are seeing that that is also a possibility, but that when we're thinking about things, crimes like child pornography, for example, we're very clear about censoring those kinds of acts because they are very criminal in nature and they incite to criminal activity. And so I think that that fits in very nicely with what Stephen Cohen's organization is trying to do. I also would like to talk about the bullying that we heard from Seth, the anti-bullying campaigns that they have to kind of systematically break down speech that is hateful, speech that is dehumanizing, and specifically how to help individuals confront the situation, helping the target themselves, how to find other allies to support your project in order to remember that all of us are in it together as allies. When one individual is being targeted for any kind of violence or hate, that is really affecting us as a society. And also when to know when to report, and that's going to cause, some parents, maybe some students, food for thought to really think about, is this an appropriate time to report, is it not? And I think the ADL would offer really great information about that to learn more so that you're not overreacting and you're not underreacting as well. And we can interrupt the cycle of violence that we sometimes see. Just beautifully presented the idea of prevention and intervention. And I would encourage all of you as educators, as students, as sisters and brothers, and parents to really take a look at their work. And then finally, talking about Stephen Cohen's work and thinking about how do we as a society choose to create rules about what is okay in the public space and what isn't. And that really kind of actually ties back to what Reverend Stowe talked about, which is how do we really know what our boundaries are? How do we know what the boundaries between free speech and hate speech? And so in many ways, our first speaker and our last speaker all tie in together. And it's important to note that when we're thinking about what is available in that space, someone like Anwar al-Awlaki, for example, he had very popular CD sets before any form of radicalization, before any sort of hate speech was coming, any kind of violent speech was coming from him. He had very popular CD sets among Muslim communities where he spoke very articulately about things, he spoke very charismatically about things. And I think that's what this, this individual, this brother is probably speaking about. And it's unfortunate because as people progress, they change, and we have to be able to know also when to stop listening to someone that has made that, that awful turn. And I think that, what Stephen Cohen's organization is trying to do is to really pull out the rug from underneath, individuals that really spend an enormous amount of time and resources to recruit tens of thousands of people to a message of real danger, of real criminality. And so, I think that that's a part also of our mission as a society so that we can create those boundaries. And obviously, we should have discussions about what those boundaries should look like, when is there an overstep. We talked about, for example, the right to tweet or not. Is there a First Amendment right to tweet? How much of that is freedom of speech, and when does it become potentially dangerous speech, although there are no laws against dangerous speech. So I wanted to thank all of you for attending. I really appreciate your attention, your ability to last this long. This is the crew, this right here in this group right now. You guys are really dedicated to the issues. I want to complete our talk today with a quote from 1991 Nobel Peace Prize winner and Burmese opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who said, "It is not power that corrupts, but fear." So I think that's what we should really walk away with, and kind of tie in exactly with what Reverend Stowe talked about, and with Martin Luther King Jr.'s words as well. When we fear what that which we do not understand, and we don't understand because we are separated from one another. So I hope that we can increase in our dialogue, and I hope that each of you has a safe ride home. Thank you so much.